Ancient superhighways once connected the world, then vanished without a trace. These lost travel corridors were the lifeblood of empires, carrying everything from silk and spices to revolutionary ideas. So why did they disappear from the map and from memory? By the end of this journey, you will understand the fragile forces that build and obliterate our global connections. We will uncover why a northern branch of the Silk Road was erased by shifting sands, and what secrets lie beneath the Saharan dunes where gold caravans once rolled. Every vanished path holds a story of human ambition clashing with an unforgiving world. What forgotten corridor do you think might still be waiting to be found? A caravan of camels moves not across blistering deserts but through vast, whispering grasslands under an endless sky. This was the Silk Road's lost northern branch, a forgotten highway that once rivaled its southern cousin. While the main route faced constant political upheaval and bandit raids, this northern path offered a quieter, though no less challenging, alternative. It snaked from the heart of China through the high steppes of Central Asia and onward to the ports of the Black Sea. This corridor was not just for luxury goods like silk and spices. It was a conduit for something far more revolutionary: ideas. Along this route, the technology of papermaking traveled west, fundamentally altering how knowledge was recorded and shared across continents. The lifeblood of this route was the interaction between nomadic tribes and the settled empires at its endpoints. These steppe cultures were not isolated. They were the essential middlemen, facilitating a cultural exchange that shaped languages, art, and even culinary traditions. Evidence of this vibrant past is etched into the landscape itself, if you know where to look. Archaeologists have unearthed hordes of coins in remote Siberian valleys, currencies from empires thousands of miles apart, found resting together. The crumbling stone foundations of caravanserais, the roadside inns for weary travelers, dot regions that are now empty and desolate. So why did this bustling artery simply fade from the map? The answer lies in a one-two punch of environmental and economic change. Climatic shifts gradually turned once fertile grazing lands arid, making the long journey unsustainable for large caravans. Then came the final blow, the rise of reliable sea trade. Why brave the harsh, unpredictable interior when a ship could carry more goods more cheaply? The northern branch became an economic ghost, its purpose erased by the tides of progress. The scattered artifacts left behind pose a tantalizing question. What other secrets about our interconnected ancient world were lost when the sands and the seas reclaimed these paths? This pattern of a thriving network undone by the natural world finds an even starker example in our next lost corridor. Deep beneath the Sahara's sea of sand lie the bones of an empire built on water. The Garamantes were not merely desert nomads, they were master engineers who turned one of the world's harshest environments into a hub of commerce and power. Their kingdom, centered in what is now Libya, thrived by creating a network of underground tunnels known as fagaras. These were not simple wells, but complex, gravity-fed irrigation systems that tapped into ancient fossil water, channeling it for miles to create oases of agriculture in the heart of the desert. This mastery of water was the foundation for their true achievement, a lost corridor of trade that funneled gold, ivory, and salt from sub-Saharan Africa to the eager markets of the Mediterranean. How did a civilization flourish where today there is only emptiness? They built a system of fortified towns and outposts, connected by routes that allowed for the surprisingly rapid movement of goods. Historical accounts and archaeological finds, including remnants of their iconic chariots, suggest they could move across the desert with stunning speed, controlling the flow of wealth. This network was so vital that it later became a conduit for the spread of Islam northward, carrying faith along with fortune. But the very ingenuity that built this empire also contained the seeds of its destruction. The Fagaras required constant, laborious maintenance, and over centuries, the Garamantes drained their precious underground aquifers faster than they could be replenished. As the water levels dropped, the desert began to reclaim its land. This environmental strain was compounded by a massive economic shock, the slow collapse of the Roman Empire, their primary trading partner to the north. Demand for their goods dried up just as their water did. By the 5th century, intensified climate shifts delivered the final blow, burying their farms, their cities, and their roads under the advancing dunes. Today, the routes of the Garamantes are so completely lost that only satellite imagery can detect the faint, ghostly lines of their ancient paths beneath the sand. Their story is a stark lesson in human ambition, a reminder that even the most advanced systems are fragile when they push an environment too far. This theme of a watery domain connecting a civilization only to be its undoing finds a powerful echo far to the east, where another great network vanished beneath the waves. A great civilization once thrived along a mighty, flowing river, its docks bustling with trade. This was the Gagga-Hakra river system, the lost aquatic highway of the Indus Valley people. While we often picture their cities like Mohenjo-Daro as marvels of urban planning, their true lifeblood was the network of waterways connecting them. Boats laden with precious lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, bales of finely woven cotton, and heavy sacks of grain moved constantly between settlements. This was not a haphazard collection of villages, but a tightly integrated economic zone, a fact proven by the discovery of standardized stone weights and measures across a vast region. From a small town to a major city, a merchant could trust that a unit of weight was the same, a level of coordination that speaks of a sophisticated and centralized trade network. The ruins of Lothal provide perhaps the most stunning evidence, a massive, engineered dockyard complete with locks to control water levels, a harbor designed for the coming and going of cargo ships. How could such a vital and advanced system simply cease to function? The river itself began to fail. Geological and climate data suggest that tectonic shifts may have stolen the water, diverting the life-giving streams that fed the Gagga-Hakra. Others point to changing monsoon patterns that slowly turned a reliable watercourse into a series of seasonal puddles, and then into a dry, sandy grave. The river corridor silted up, becoming impassable. Without this essential link, the economic bonds between cities frayed and then snapped. Populations were forced to migrate in search of reliable water, abandoning the grand urban centers to the dust. The entire civilization did not so much collapse as it unraveled, its connections severed. This loss is compounded by our inability to fully read their script, the cryptic symbols found on seals that might detail the very trade agreements and routes we can now only guess at. The discovery of Mesopotamian cylinder seals in Harappan ruins confirms they were part of a global ancient world, yet the specific river paths their sailors took are now just ghost lines on a map. The fate of the Indus waterways is a sobering lesson in dependency, a reminder that the most brilliant human achievements are tethered to the whims of the natural world. Just as a river can create a civilization, its disappearance can erase the very routes that held it together. This theme of a watery domain vanishing continues, but our next journey takes us from silting riverbeds into the deep, open sea, where an entire maritime highway was swallowed by the ocean itself. Long before the Phoenicians became famous for their sea voyages, another civilization was mastering the open ocean. the Minoans of Crete built a maritime network so vast it may have reached the stormy coasts of Britain and the Baltic shores of Scandinavia. Their ships, powered by oars and sails, did not just ply the familiar waters of the Mediterranean. They ventured beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the ancient name for the Strait of Gibraltar, into the raw, uncharted expanse of the Atlantic. Their target was not just adventure but vital resources. In an age defined by bronze, they desperately needed tin, a metal scarce in the Mediterranean but plentiful in places like Cornwall, England. They also sought the golden glow of amber from the far north, a substance as valuable as gemstones. These were not occasional trips, but established sea lanes, corridors of commerce that connected the sophisticated palaces of Crete to the raw material sources of prehistoric Europe. How did they accomplish such feats of navigation without modern instruments? They were masters of the sky, reading the stars, the flight paths of birds, and the subtle shifts of ocean currents to guide their wooden hulls across terrifyingly open water. Evidence of their reach is subtle but compelling. Archaeologists have found Minoan-style pottery on the island of Sardinia, a potential stepping stone on the journey west. More tellingly, artistic motifs from Crete appear to have influenced metalwork and jewelry found in Atlantic Europe, suggesting a slow, steady exchange of ideas along with goods. The great historian Cyprian Broodbank argues these routes were the lifeblood of their bronze-based economy, yet they left almost no physical trace. Their ships were made of wood, their records were kept in perishable materials or oral tradition, and their ports were built at a time when sea levels were dramatically lower. When their civilization was struck by a 1-2 punch of catastrophes, the knowledge of these routes vanished almost completely. The colossal volcanic eruption on the island of Thera, modern-day Santorini, likely triggered tsunamis that devastated their fleet and coastal infrastructure. This was followed by invasions from the Greek mainland, which severed the intricate cultural and economic networks the Minoans had woven. The Great Sea corridors were simply forgotten, their existence fading into the realm of myth. The loss was profound, not just of trade, but of the sophisticated navigational technology that made it possible. What star charts were lost? What understanding of Atlantic currents died with the last Minoan captain? This maritime mystery demonstrates how entire worlds of knowledge can be erased by disaster. It also makes us wonder if the later Phoenicians, famed explorers in their own right, were merely rediscovering paths that the Minoans had mapped centuries before. From sea lanes swallowed by rising waters and forgotten memory, we turn to a corridor of an entirely different kind, one carved not through ocean waves but through sheets of ice. A vast, grassy plain stretched for hundreds of miles between continents, a world now entirely lost beneath the cold, churning waters of the Bering Sea. This was Beringia, the ultimate vanished corridor, a land bridge that served as the gateway for the first people to enter the Americas. During the last great ice age, so much water was locked in massive glaciers that global sea levels plummeted, exposing this sprawling subcontinent. It was not a barren, icy wasteland but a surprisingly fertile landscape, a refuge for steppe bison, woolly mammoths, and the bands of hunter-gatherers who tracked them. These ancient people did not just cross a narrow bridge, they lived and thrived across this vast expanse for generations, following a network of paths that shifted with the seasons and the migrating herds. The evidence for this epic journey is written not in stone monuments, but in our very genes. Genetic studies show a clear and undeniable link between the indigenous populations of the Americas and the ancient peoples of Siberia, a connection forged over millennia in the heart of Beringia. Archaeological sites like Swan Point in Alaska provide tangible proof of this habitation, revealing stone tools and the remains of the animals they hunted. painting a picture of a successful and adaptable way of life. Yet the exact nature of their migration remains one of archaeology's greatest debates. Was it a rapid push southward as an ice-free corridor opened up, or a much slower coastal migration, with families hopping from one resource-rich haven to another? The tools and animal remains found on both sides of the strait support both theories, leaving the precise timing and routes shrouded in mystery. Then the world changed once more. As the Ice Age waned and the colossal glaciers melted, all that trapped water returned to the oceans. The seas began a relentless rise, slowly and irrevocably flooding the Beringian plain. What was once a continuous landscape fractured into islands and then vanished entirely beneath the waves. The bridge was severed, isolating the peoples of the Americas from their Eurasian origins for thousands of years. This single geographical event shaped the entire cultural trajectory of two continents, allowing for the independent and spectacular development of countless civilizations, from the Maya to the Inca, all because a critical travel corridor disappeared without a trace. From this icy passage that defined human history, we journey to a corridor of a completely different character, one that thrived in the dense, humid jungles of Southeast Asia before being consumed by the relentless green. A perfectly straight line cuts through the impossible tangle of the jungle, a ghost of white stone beneath the green canopy. These were the Sacbeob, the monumental white roads of the Maya, and they represented a triumph of human will over a relentless environment. Built from precisely fitted limestone and sealed with a stucco mortar that gleamed under the sun, these raised causeways were not mere trails. They were elevated highways, engineered to remain dry and passable during the torrential rains, connecting great city-states across the Yucatan Peninsula. Some of these corridors stretched for over 100 kilometers in a nearly flawless straight line, an incredible feat of surveying and determination. They were the vital arteries of Maya civilization, carrying more than just trade goods. Along these smooth paths traveled jade from the mountains, a razor-sharp obsidian for tools and weapons, and perhaps most importantly, cacao beans, which were used as currency. But these roads also carried pilgrims to sacred shrines, messengers between ruling families and armies on the march. The Sacbe was not just a physical structure, it was a symbol of order and connection in a cosmos the Maya saw as constantly threatened by chaos. Why would such a sophisticated network, so essential to their world, be allowed to vanish? The answer is tied to the great mystery of the Maya collapse. Around the 9th century, a confluence of crises struck. Prolonged and severe droughts parched the land, making it difficult to support large urban populations. Intensified warfare between competing city-states disrupted the very political alliances the roads helped maintain. Furthermore, centuries of farming had exhausted the thin tropical soils, leading to food shortages. One by one, the great ceremonial centers were abandoned. As the people left, the meticulous maintenance required to hold back the jungle ceased. The rainforest, which had been held at bay for centuries, began its slow, steady reconquest. Roots pried apart the perfect stonework, and humus buried the bright white surfaces. Within generations, the corridors were gone, their locations preserved only in faint folk memories. Modern technology, however, is now pulling them back from oblivion. Using LiDAR, which uses laser pulses to see through the dense forest canopy, archaeologists are discovering that the known Sacbeob were just the beginning. They have mapped vast, hidden networks of roads connecting smaller settlements to larger ones, revealing a level of integration and central planning previously unimaginable. One of the most famous, Sacbe No. 1, runs straight from the city of Kaba to the distant site of Yaxuna, a bold statement of power and connection across the landscape. Yet for every road we rediscover, countless more likely remain hidden, their stories untold. What ceremonies began at dawn on these white paths? What urgent news was carried by runners from one city to the next? The silence of the jungle holds those secrets close, a reminder that even the most solidly built corridors are fragile when the society that built them falls apart. This story of a highland network reclaimed by nature finds a powerful parallel further south, where another great empire carved its own paths across even more impossible terrain. High in the Andes, stone pathways cling to mountainsides, defying gravity and logic. This was the Quijapac-Ñan, the Inca royal road, a masterwork of engineering that bound a vast empire together. We know of its core routes celebrated by UNESCO, but its farthest extensions are the ones that vanished into legend. These were the tentacles of imperial power, reaching deep into the Amazonian cloud forests and along forgotten coastal deserts. They transported not just gold and exquisite textiles, but also the quipu, those intricate knotted cords that served as the empire's memory, recording everything from tax obligations to sacred stories. The system was a marvel of logistics, maintained by a relay of trained runners who could carry messages and lightweight goods over staggering distances in a matter of days. But the Spanish conquest of the 16th century did not just disrupt this network, it sought to dismantle it completely. The roads were the veins of Inca control, and the conquistadors aimed for the heart. They suppressed the indigenous knowledge that built and maintained the corridors, from the engineers who designed suspension bridges woven from mountain grass to the runners who memorized every turn. This deliberate destruction was accelerated by nature's own fury. Earthquakes and landslides, unchecked by maintenance, tumbled stone retaining walls into deep ravines. The introduction of European diseases then decimated the local populations who had for generations served as the road's caretakers and guides. Without them, the most remote extensions simply faded back into the wilderness. Today, oral histories from Andean communities speak of these lost paths, sometimes hinting at routes to mythical places like Paititi, a legendary city of gold. These are not just fairy tales. Recent expeditions into unexplored valleys have uncovered caches of Inca artifacts far from any known road, suggesting entire branches of the network are still waiting to be found. The loss of these extensions fragmented the Inca world, isolating communities and severing the cultural and economic ties that had made the empire so resilient. From the high Andes, our search for lost connections takes us across another ocean, to a corridor that linked the great kingdoms of ancient Africa to the bustling trade of the Indian Ocean. A thriving port city once stood somewhere along the East African coast, a place where Roman glassware was traded for massive elephant tusks and gleaming tortoise shell. This was Rhapta, the legendary hub of a maritime corridor that connected the continent to the wider Indian Ocean world. Greco-Roman merchants, guided by a text called the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, would sail their dhows south on the reliable monsoon winds, their hulls filled with wine and fine pottery. They returned north with holds packed full of African luxury, navigating by the stars and this ancient trade guide that frustratingly describes Rhapta's wealth but fails to pinpoint its exact location. The city was not an isolated outpost. It was the heart of a network known as Azania, a corridor managed by Bantu-speaking peoples who controlled the flow of goods from the African interior to the coast. How could such a central node simply vanish from the map? The answer lies in the dynamic nature of coastlines and commerce. Rhapta's harbor may have succumbed to coastal erosion or silted up by river deposits, rendering it useless for large ships. Then, as political and economic power shifted centuries later, new ports like Kilwa and Mombasa rose to prominence. these new centers, with their deeper harbors and stronger sultanates, simply eclipsed the old routes. The memory of Rhapta faded, its precise location becoming a geographical ghost. Yet evidence of its vibrant past continues to surface. Archaeologists like Felix Chaume have uncovered Roman coins and pottery shards on Tanzanian islands, tangible proof of that long-distance trade. These finds confirm the cultural blending that occurred there, a mix of African, Arab, and Greco-Roman influences that would eventually give rise to the distinct Swahili culture. But the city itself, the physical heart of this lost corridor, remains stubbornly hidden, perhaps just offshore beneath the waves or buried under modern developments. Its disappearance speaks to a profound truth that even the most prosperous trade routes are temporary, vulnerable to the slow grind of environmental change and the relentless tide of economic progress. From this maritime mystery swallowed by the Indian Ocean, we turn inland to a corridor that vanished in the vast, arid heart of Central Asia, where empires rose and fell along a forgotten road. A mounted Persian courier could ride from the heart of the empire to its farthest frontier in a matter of days, not weeks. This was the power of the royal road's forgotten eastern spur, a ribbon of order stretching from the grand palaces of Susa to the remote, fortified cities of Bactria in Central Asia. Established by King Darius I, this was not a single path but a meticulously integrated network of existing local trails, upgraded and fortified into an imperial highway. Its primary cargo was not silk or spices, but information and authority. At regular intervals stood royal way stations, stocked with fresh horses and supplies, allowing messengers to ride at a relentless pace without stopping. These riders carried cuneiform tablets inscribed with imperial decrees and military intelligence, the vital data stream that held a sprawling, multicultural empire together. The system was so efficient it would inspire similar networks for centuries to come. Yet today, finding its precise route is a challenge for archaeologists. In places like modern-day Afghanistan, they uncover the ghost of this corridor not in the road itself, but in the Achaemenid-style architecture of ancient sites and the scattered administrative seals that hint at a once unified system of control. So how does a highway so vital to a superpower simply vanish from use? The empire itself shattered. The conquests of Alexander the Great, while initially using these very roads for his own armies, ultimately broke the centralized Persian administration that funded and maintained them. The great empire fractured into smaller, warring Hellenistic kingdoms, and the costly, empire-wide relay system was no longer a priority for any single state. As political unity dissolved, so did the road's purpose. Then, the environment delivered the final blow. Shifting sand dunes in Central Asia began to reclaim the path, burying the way stations and obscuring the markers. Without a powerful central authority to marshal the labor for constant clearing and repair, the corridor faded back into the landscape. The loss of this infrastructure had a profound and quiet impact on the flow of ideas. The constant, reliable movement of people and messages along this road had facilitated the exchange of everything from artistic motifs to religious concepts between Persia, India, and Central Asia. When the road fell silent, that steady current of cultural cross-pollination was replaced by a more sporadic, haphazard trickle. It makes you wonder what other philosophical or technological innovations were slowed or diverted entirely when this great corridor of communication was severed. This story of a centralized network undone by fragmentation finds a striking parallel in the far north, where a very different kind of road connected the classical world to what they called the barbarian lands. A trader in ancient Rome might hold a polished piece of amber, its golden hue catching the light, utterly unaware of the epic journey it had taken. This was the Amber Road, a sprawling network of trails that channeled the fossilized resin from the cold shores of the Baltic Sea to the warm heart of the Mediterranean. While we often picture a single, well-defined highway, the truth is far more fascinating. The northern trails were a web of alternative paths, snaking through the river valleys and deep forests of Eastern Europe. These routes served as vital backups, activated when political strife or terrible weather closed the more direct corridors. For centuries, Germanic and other local tribes acted as the essential intermediaries, guiding the precious cargo from one territory to the next. The value of this substance was immense. It was not merely decorative. Amber was believed to hold magical properties, used in religious amulets and high-status jewelry for Roman elites. This cultural importance is etched into the earth itself, with hordes of raw and worked amber being discovered in chieftain burials far from the coast, marking the graves of powerful middlemen who controlled the flow of this northern gold. The Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder even spun tales of its origin, describing it as the solidified tiers of poplar trees, a poetic guess for a material whose true source was a mystery to the Mediterranean world. Yet for all the amber that has been found, the exact overland trails remain stubbornly hypothetical. Why did such a vibrant network simply fade away? The collapse of the Roman Empire was a death knell. The sophisticated economy that craved such luxuries fractured, and demand plummeted. At the same time, environmental shifts slowly altered the very landscape of the route, with rivers changing their courses and forests reclaiming the clearings. Soon, merchants found it safer and cheaper to move goods by sea, abandoning the overgrown paths for the open water. The northern trails fell silent, their specific stories of cultural exchange, of the languages and customs shared around campfires, lost to time. What songs were sung or what news was traded along those forest paths, we may never know. This focus on the transport of a precious mineral finds a direct parallel in another vanished corridor, one that moved a substance so vital it was literally worth its weight in gold. A caravan moves in absolute silence across a world of burning white, each camel laden with slabs of salt so pure they glitter like crystal in the Saharan sun. This was the Tichitt-Walata corridor, a network of trails that for centuries connected the salt pans of the central Sahara to the gold-rich kingdoms of West Africa. Long before the famous empires of Ghana or Mali rose to power, the settlements of the Tichitt-Walata complex were forging one of the continent's earliest urban societies, and their currency was salt. In a land where the mineral was scarcer than gold, these heavy, pale bricks were literally worth their weight in precious metal. The people of this region did not merely wander, they built for permanence. Across the arid landscape, they constructed remarkable dry stone architecture, complex settlements with circular compounds, defensive walls, and granaries that hinted at a highly organized and stratified society. These stone-way stations were vital oases of order in a sea of sand, providing shelter, supplies, and security for the caravans that moved the life-giving mineral south. The trade along this route was about more than economics, it was a profound cultural exchange. Berber traders from the north met with sub-Saharan African groups in the south, exchanging not just salt for gold, but also languages, technologies, and spiritual beliefs along these sandy highways. Archaeologists like Susan Keach McIntosh have pieced together this story from the silent stones, finding evidence of a society that mastered its harsh environment for generations. But how does such a vital network simply fade from use? The desert itself began to advance, a long, gradual process of desertification, a relentless increase in aridity, made the journeys longer, more perilous, and ultimately less profitable. Water sources that had sustained caravans for centuries dried up, and the dunes began their slow, patient work of burial. At the same time, new salt sources were discovered closer to the emerging power centers in the south, making the long, dangerous trek from the deep Sahara economically obsolete. The great salt mines like Tagheza, once bustling hubs of industry, were gradually abandoned, their locations becoming so remote that they were lost to all but a few desert nomads. The disappearance of these routes triggered a dramatic shift in the balance of power across West Africa. The economic heartland moved decisively southward, fueling the rise of new empires built on gold, while the ancient stone settlements of the Tichitt-Walata region were left to the sands, their corridors erased as if they had never been. The loss was not just of a trade route, but of a whole chapter of African urbanism, a testament to how deeply our civilizations are shaped by the paths we walk, and how fragile those paths can be when the climate itself turns against them. This theme of a vast oceanic network connecting islands and cultures finds a powerful echo far from the Sahara, in the endless blue of the Pacific. A master navigator reads the ocean itself, watching the swell patterns reflected on the underside of clouds and the specific flight paths of seabirds heading toward land. This was the world of the Lapita people, the ancient pioneers who unlocked the Pacific. Their voyages were not accidental drifts but deliberate, skilled expansions across thousands of kilometers of open ocean. From around 1500 BCE, they sailed from the islands near New Guinea, pushing ever eastward across the vast blue unknown in sophisticated outrigger canoes. These vessels were their arks of civilization, carrying everything needed to start anew: families, domesticated animals like pigs and chickens, and the precious shoots of staple crops like taro and yam. Their greatest legacy, however, was the web of sea corridors they established, a network that connected islands from the Bismarck archipelago all the way to Samoa, facilitating the greatest human migration story ever told. The evidence of their passage is stamped into the earth of every island they touched in the form of their distinctive pottery. These are not plain, utilitarian vessels. They are decorated with intricate geometric patterns, often made by stamping a comb-like tool into the clay before firing. Finding a shard of this pottery on a remote beach is like finding a signature on a map. It proves a connection, a shared cultural identity across a staggering expanse of water. Archaeologists like Patrick Vinton Kirch have used these pottery fragments to trace their movement, finding that the chemical signature of obsidian tools in Vanuatu can be traced back to quarries in Papua New Guinea, a journey of over 2,000 kilometers. How did they achieve such feats of navigation without charts or compasses? Their knowledge was an oral encyclopedia of the natural world. They memorized the rising and setting points of hundreds of stars. They understood the deep, rhythmic ocean swells that could guide a canoe for days even when the sky was overcast. They could detect the faint scent of vegetation on the wind or spot the greenish reflection of a distant lagoon on the underside of a cloud. This was not guesswork, it was a science passed down from master to apprentice through chance and practical experience. Yet the precise sea lanes they followed, the exact corridors of exploration, remain one of history's great puzzles. Why would such successful routes simply fade from use? As the Lapita settled each new island group, they established self-sufficient communities. The urgent need for long-distance voyaging to maintain contact with their homelands diminished over generations. The focus shifted to local trade and inter-island travel within new, smaller spheres. The most ambitious corridors, the long highways back to the west, slowly fell into disuse. The specialized knowledge required for the longest journeys began to fragment, preserved only in fragments within the seafaring traditions that would later fuel the Polynesian explosion further east. The genetic links between modern Pacific Islanders confirm this epic story of connection, a biological map of their incredible journey. but the loss of those specific long-distance routes meant that islands that were once in communication became isolated, developing their own unique cultures and languages. What stories were lost when the last navigator who knew the direct path to the ancestral homeland passed away? What knowledge of distant resources or alliances simply evaporated? The Lapita corridors show us that a map can exist not on parchment, but in the collective memory of a people, and that such a map is perhaps the most fragile of all. This story of a vast network connecting islands and cultures finds a powerful echo not in the sea, but in the vast grassy plains that once connected Europe and Asia. A golden stag gleams in the dim light, its powerful antlers twisted back as if in mid-leap. This masterpiece of Scythian gold was not found in a palace or a city, but deep within a burial mound rising from the endless grass. These kurgans are the silent sentinels of the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the only permanent marks left by a people who lived in motion. For centuries, Scythian horsemen mastered the vast corridor between the Black Sea and the Caspian, a rolling sea of grass that was their domain. Their trails were not paved with stone, but worn into the earth by countless hooves and the wheels of their felt-covered wagons. These were the ultimate nomadic highways, carrying a flow of goods that connected worlds. Greek wine amphorae from the Black Sea coast were traded for Chinese silks that had already traveled thousands of miles, with Scythian goldwork, furs, and horses serving as the currency of this sprawling exchange. The Greek historian Herodotus described them with a mix of awe and fear, writing of their mastery of the bow from horseback and their vast, mobile society. He recorded tales of a royal clan that ruled this network, a web of paths that allowed them to interact with settled empires on all sides, from the Greeks to the Persians and even indirectly with the Chinese. This was not a random wandering. It was a highly organized system of movement dictated by seasons, grazing lands, and trade opportunities. The Scythians were the essential link, the middlemen of the ancient steppe. Their corridors were the conduit for revolutionary technologies. The very concept of advanced horseback riding, including the saddle and the composite bow, spread along these routes. Sophisticated metalworking techniques for crafting both intricate jewelry and deadly weapons moved with them, shaping the military and artistic landscape of Eurasia. Why then are their daily paths so utterly invisible to us? Their entire culture was built around portability. They lived in collapsible felt tents, used leather for containers and clothing, and left no cities or forts behind. The only things they built to last were their tombs. The frozen kurgans of sites like Pazyryk in Siberia are time capsules, preserving not just that golden stag, but brilliantly colored carpets, elaborate horse headdresses, and even tattoos on the skin of chieftains. These burials reveal a stunning network of contact, with goods from China and India resting beside local creations. Yet the paths that brought these objects together have vanished, completely absorbed by the grasslands and modern farmland. The corridors did not collapse from a single disaster. They faded as the Scythians themselves were gradually absorbed by rival nomadic groups like the Sarmatians, who moved in and dominated the same territories. At the same time, the southern branches of the Silk Road became more established and secure, offering a more reliable, if less direct, path for merchants. The economic heart of long-distance trade shifted south, and the Scythian steppe corridors, once throbbing with life, fell silent. Their legacy, however, is profound. How many ideas, from artistic motifs to spiritual beliefs, were carried by these silent riders across the roof of the world? The influence of the steppe corridor echoes in the tack of a medieval knight's horse and in the designs of metalwork found a continent away. They built an empire of movement, not stone, and when the movement stopped, the earth itself closed over their tracks. This theme of a hidden network continues, but our next journey takes us from the open grasslands into a world of darkness, to a corridor that ran deep beneath the mountains. An entire city could vanish in plain sight, its streets and homes hidden deep beneath the earth. In the heart of Cappadocia, a labyrinth of underground corridors and multi-level cities was carved from the soft volcanic rock, a secret world built for survival. During times of invasion, from Roman legions to Arab armies, the entire population of a surface town could disappear below ground, sealing themselves behind massive, wheel-shaped stone doors that rolled into place to block the tunnels. These were not simple hiding holes. Settlements like Derinkuyu descended up to 18 stories deep, with hundreds of individual rooms connected by a maze of narrow, defensible passages. They housed everything a community needed to endure a long siege, from stables for livestock and presses for making wine, to intricate ventilation shafts that brought fresh air from the surface to the deepest chambers. Historians like Robert Ousterhout point out that this was more than a refuge. It was a functioning subterranean economy. Certain corridors were used to transport goods like grain and wine between different underground complexes, a hidden supply line that operated independently from the world above. The walls of some chambers still bear faded Christian frescoes, silent echoes of the communities who once prayed and lived in this stone silence. So why were these incredible sanctuaries eventually abandoned and forgotten? As the political landscape stabilized and surface life became safer over the centuries, the immense effort of maintaining these deep cities was no longer justified. Major earthquakes collapsed entire sections, rendering corridors impassable. Slow, steady erosion from water and wind silted up entrances and air shafts. When the region's Christian populations later declined or were displaced, the knowledge of how to navigate and maintain the labyrinth was lost. Generations simply sealed the entrances and built their lives above, leaving the hidden world to legend and local tales of hidden treasure. Modern archaeologists and explorers are still mapping the full extent of this network, often discovering new chambers by accident. The mystery of Cappadocia is not just how it was built, but the profound human fear that drove its creation. What level of threat makes a society choose to live in the dark, and what other underground networks, now completely sealed, might still lie beneath our feet, their stories buried with the last person who knew the way? This story of a passage carved through the earth leads us to a corridor that achieved the impossible, crossing the very roof of the world. A caravan of yaks moves in a slow, deliberate line across a windswept pass so high the air itself feels thin. This was the Nangpa La, one of the ancient Himalayan salt corridors, a network of trails that for thousands of years connected the high plateau of Tibet to the lush valleys of Nepal. In a world defined by scarcity, salt was a form of currency, and these paths were its financial arteries. Traders from Tibet would make the arduous journey south, their yaks laden with heavy slabs of precious rock salt mined from high-altitude lakes. In return, they carried back grain, spices, and metal goods from the lowlands, a vital exchange that sustained communities on both sides of the roof of the world. But these routes carried more than just goods. They were conduits for faith, with Buddhist monks and pilgrims traveling alongside the merchants, spreading teachings and establishing monasteries that became essential way stations. These religious outposts offered shelter, spiritual solace, and safe passage, their prayer flags snapping in the mountain wind a beacon of hope in an otherwise merciless landscape. The journey was a calculated gamble with nature itself. As scholar John Belleza notes, these paths were only passable during brief seasonal windows, and they demanded an intimate, generational knowledge of the mountains. Local guides born to this environment could read the subtle signs of an impending avalanche or a shifting glacier. their expertise meaning the difference between life and death for the entire caravan. The cultural weight of salt was immense, embedded in local rituals and bartering systems. Old trade maps, often passed down orally or sketched on cloth, show a surprisingly dense network linking places like Lhasa and Kathmandu, a web of human connection across the most formidable terrain on Earth. So how did these deeply rooted corridors vanish? The change began with the emergence of cheaper, more accessible salt from mines in India, which slowly eroded the economic necessity of the treacherous Tibetan trade. But the final, decisive blow was political. The Chinese annexation of Tibet in the 20th century and the subsequent sealing of its borders transformed these ancient thoroughfares into militarized frontiers. Passes that had seen foot traffic for millennia were suddenly blocked by checkpoints and fences. The steady flow of people and culture was severed almost overnight. The impact on remote Himalayan communities was profound and isolating. Villages that had relied on the salt grain exchange for their very survival found their economic lifeline cut. The loss went beyond mere commerce. It was a severing of cultural and familial ties that had stretched across the mountains for generations. The oral traditions that preserved the intricate knowledge of the routes began to fade, as fewer and fewer people had reason to make the journey. Today, many of these passes are silent, their stories preserved only in the memories of the oldest generation. What songs were sung to keep rhythm on the long climbs? What news and ideas were exchanged in the cramped shelters of a monastery guesthouse? The loss of the Himalayan salt corridors is a stark reminder that a border on a map can erase a reality that existed for centuries, silencing the footsteps that once connected two worlds. From these high, severed passages, we descend to a corridor that once spanned the entire interior of a continent. A silent city of earth rises from the fertile floodplain, its grand plaza overlooking a river teeming with dugout canoes. This was Cahokia, the beating heart of a continent-spanning network of river corridors that defined the Mississippian world for centuries. From around 800 to 1500 CE, the Mississippi River and its countless tributaries were not just sources of water and food, they were liquid highways. Along these routes, canoes carried raw copper from the distant Great Lakes, shimmering seashells from the Gulf Coast, and finely crafted ceremonial objects from one mound center to another. These goods were more than mere commodities. They were the physical symbols of a shared religious and political system that bound communities from Wisconsin to Louisiana. The trade was the engine that allowed for the rise of immense urban centers like Cahokia, which at its peak was larger than many contemporary European cities. Archaeologists like Timothy R. Pocketat point to the wide distribution of distinctively engraved shell cups and ornaments as proof of this deep interconnection. A design carved in present-day Oklahoma might be found on a pot in Illinois, a silent testament to the conversations and beliefs flowing along these waterways. The great mounds themselves, like the monumental Monk's Mound at Cahokia, were not just burial sites for elites, they were stages for elaborate ceremonies that drew pilgrims from across the river network, reinforcing a shared identity. So how could such a vibrant and deeply rooted system vanish so completely? The collapse was a perfect storm of calamities, a prolonged period of climatic instability, including severe droughts and unpredictable floods, put immense strain on the agricultural base that supported these large populations. This environmental stress likely fueled increased warfare between competing chiefdoms, disrupting the very trade that had once maintained peace. Then came the invisible, devastating blow. European contact in the 16th century introduced Old World diseases for which the indigenous populations had no immunity. Epidemics of smallpox and measles raced along these same river corridors, decimating communities and shattering social structures. Colonial policies further dismantled the remaining indigenous economies, severing the ancient trade links for good. By the time European explorers like Hernando de Soto journeyed through the region, they encountered the remnants of a broken world, the great mounds standing empty and overgrown, their purpose already fading into legend. The swiftness of the collapse means we are left with profound mysteries. What spiritual beliefs were tied to the journey of a copper effigy from the north to the south? What songs did the traders sing as they paddled past the bluffs that now hold our modern cities? The silence of the mounds is absolute, a stark American enigma. The story of a great continental network undone by external forces finds a parallel across the ocean, where another ancient corridor linked the warm Mediterranean to the wild, untamed Atlantic. A bronze sword forged in Spain might have been shaped with tin from a windswept English moor. The Tartessian civilization of southern Iberia mastered these Atlantic sea lanes, their ships braving the open ocean to reach the mythical Cassiterides, the tin islands we know as Cornwall and Brittany. This was not a casual trade, it was the lifeblood of the Bronze Age itself, for tin was the essential ingredient that transformed soft copper into hard, durable bronze. The Tartessians became the crucial middlemen, connecting the advanced cultures of the Mediterranean with the raw material wealth of Atlantic Europe. Greek writers like Herodotus recorded tantalizing whispers of this wealthy, distant kingdom beyond the Pillars of Hercules, a place so rich in silver and bronze it seemed almost mythical. The archaeological record confirms this connection, with hordes of distinctive Tartessian metalwork found in the British Isles and Atlantic-style motifs appearing on artifacts in Spain. This was a two-way street of influence, not just a simple extraction of resources. Yet for all the evidence of trade, the actual sea routes remain a complete mystery. How did these ancient mariners navigate the treacherous coasts and fierce currents of the Atlantic? They left no maps, no written records of their voyages. Their knowledge was stored in the memories of their captains, a mental chart of stars, currents, and landmarks. The decline of Tartessos around 500 BCE was catastrophic for this network. Intensified competition from Phoenician traders who established their own colonies and routes likely squeezed the Tartessians out. Some theories suggest a massive natural disaster, perhaps a tsunami or earthquake, devastated their coastal cities. With their civilization fading, the specialized knowledge of the Atlantic Passage faded with them. The final blow came with the rise of overland alternatives and later, the Roman conquest, which standardized trade under the control of the legions and made the old, dangerous sea routes economically obsolete. The loss of the Tartessian corridors had a subtle but profound impact on the ancient world. It severed a direct cultural link between the Mediterranean and Atlantic Europe, isolating technological and artistic developments in the British Isles for a time. One must wonder how the course of metallurgy might have changed if this vibrant exchange had continued, if ideas had flowed as freely as the tin that made the Bronze Age possible. From these vanished Atlantic sea lanes, our search turns to a corridor of a completely different nature, one that moved not across water, but through the arid, empty expanse of the Arabian desert. The scent of frankincense was once as valuable as gold, a sacred perfume that drifted from the deserts of southern Arabia to the altars of Rome and Jerusalem. This was the world of the incense routes, a network of desert corridors that for millennia carried frankincense and myrrh from the Dhofar Mountains of Oman to the Mediterranean world. The journey began with the careful cultivation of the boswellia tree, its bark slashed to release the precious, aromatic resin that hardened into tears of frankincense. Loaded onto camels in heavy sacks, this cargo did not travel a single road, but a web of trails snaking northward, each leg controlled by different tribes who guarded their territory fiercely. The Nabateans, the same people who carved the city of Petra from stone, became the master intermediaries of this trade, building way stations and controlling the flow of incense through their desert kingdom. Archaeologists have uncovered the remains of these caravanserais at places like Shisar in Oman, silent stone ruins that once offered shelter and water to weary merchants and their precious animals. An ancient text called the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea describes this region as the very land of incense, a place of legendary wealth. Yet for all these clues, the precise overland trails the caravans walked are now almost completely untraceable, buried under shifting dunes or paved over by modern highways. Why would a network so vital to the ancient economy simply fade away? The decline was a slow death by 1,000 cuts. The rise of reliable sea routes offered a cheaper, safer alternative to the perilous desert crossing. Then a profound cultural shift sealed its fate as the spread of Christianity, which favored simpler rituals without the dense smoke of pagan sacrifice, caused the demand for vast quantities of incense to plummet. The final environmental blow was desertification, as the sands steadily reclaimed the wells and paths that had sustained the caravans for centuries. What was lost when these aromatic highways fell silent? Think of the countless cultural practices that depended on that steady supply. Frankincense was burned in temples from Egypt to Babylon, used in embalming rituals and valued as medicine. Its arrival signaled worship, purification, and connection to the divine. The abandonment of the routes did not just disrupt an economy, it fundamentally altered spiritual life across the ancient world, severing a physical link that had connected distant cultures through a shared, sacred scent. Just as the desert sands closed over these ancient perfume trails, our search for lost connections now turns toward a corridor of ice and extreme cold, a path that linked the temperate world to the Arctic. A hunter's blade, carved from the tusk of a beast long dead, glinted in the weak Arctic sun. For thousands of years, the frozen river valleys of Siberia were threaded with corridors dedicated to a single, precious resource, the ivory of the woolly mammoth. Indigenous peoples like the Yakuts and the Evenki did not merely stumble upon these frozen treasures, they developed a sophisticated economy around them, following ancient, memorized paths to harvest tusks from the melting permafrost. This was not a random scavenging, it was a deliberate, seasonal trade. During the brutal winters, they traveled on seasonal ice roads using dog sleds, transporting massive tusks south to trade with merchants from China and Europe. In exchange for this Arctic gold, these remote communities received goods that transformed their lives: bolts of Chinese silk, durable metal tools, and glass beads. The value of this trade is etched into history itself, with mammoth ivory from Siberia being meticulously carved into intricate art and essential tools in workshops thousands of miles away. Scholars like Pavel F. Kuznetsov point to mammoth tusks discovered in ancient Chinese tombs as silent proof of this staggering long-distance network. Yet the actual trails these traders walked are now almost entirely lost. How does a corridor that functioned for millennia simply vanish? The extinction of the mammoth was only the beginning. While traders relied on the vast reserves of frozen carcasses, the supply was ultimately finite. Then, a shift in global trade offered a simpler alternative: the importation of elephant ivory from Africa and Asia, which could be more reliably sourced. The final blows were environmental and political. The Little Ice Age, a period of intense cooling that began in the 14th century, made the northern routes even more treacherous and unpredictable. Soon after, the eastward expansion of the Russian Empire redirected and centralized all fur and ivory trade, crushing the indigenous-controlled networks that had existed for generations. The permafrost itself, which once preserved the paths and the mammoth remains, began to betray them, thawing in some areas and obscuring the trails while freezing solid in others. Today, the only records of these routes are found in Yakut oral histories and the occasional, spectacular discovery of a fully preserved mammoth carcass, a frozen snapshot of a lost world. What stories could those river valleys tell of the sleds that moved in the endless twilight, carrying the bones of ice-age giants to build the empires of the South? The fate of the Mammoth Ivory routes is a powerful lesson in how a changing climate and shifting politics can erase even the most resilient of networks. From these frozen Arctic trails, our journey turns to a corridor that connected a sprawling island world through the sheer power of human imagination. A thalassocracy is an empire of the sea, and none exemplified this better than the Srivijaya Empire, which turned the Straits of Malacca into its private corridor of power. For over 6 centuries, this Sumatran-based kingdom did not just control trade between China and India, it was the indispensable middleman. Their large jong ships, towering wooden vessels with multiple sails and hulls, were the container ships of their day, riding the predictable monsoon winds to move history's most coveted goods. Their holds were filled with Sumatran gold, pungent cloves from the Moluccas, and the sharp scent of pepper, all destined for markets thousands of miles apart. This was more than a simple exchange of goods, it was a corridor of faith. Srivijaya became a renowned center for Buddhist scholarship, and along these same sea lanes traveled monks and sacred texts, spreading spiritual ideas that left a permanent mark on the region's culture. The Grand Borobudur Temple in Java, with its intricate stone carvings depicting ocean-going vessels, stands as a silent monument to this age of maritime connection. Inscriptions on stone pillars found throughout Sumatra boast of the empire's tributary relationships and its king's command over dozens of ports. Yet for all this evidence of its reach, the specific sea lanes Srivijaya's captains used are poorly documented. How could such a dominant network simply dissolve? The empire faced a 1-2 punch of political and environmental pressure. In the 11th century, the powerful Chola dynasty of southern India launched a series of devastating naval raids, crippling Srivijaya's ports and shattering its aura of invincibility. This military blow was compounded by a slower, more insidious enemy, silt. The very rivers that fed its capital city, Palembang, gradually deposited their sediment into the harbors, slowly choking them and making them impassable for the large jong ships that were the empire's lifeblood. As Srivijaya weakened, new political alliances formed, and rival ports like Malacca rose to prominence, offering safer harbors and better terms to merchants. The specific knowledge of the old routes, the best channels and hidden anchorages, faded away as captains shifted their business elsewhere. This Southeast Asian mystery of a vanished maritime web finds a powerful parallel on another continent, where a corridor of a completely different kind moved wealth across the vast African savanna. A herdsman's song once carried for miles across the dry grasslands, a sound marking the passage of thousands of cattle on the move. For millennia, the Sahel was crisscrossed by these vast trans-African cattle routes, a living corridor of hoofbeats and dust that stretched from the shores of West Africa to the savannas of the East. This was not a simple wandering, but a sophisticated seasonal migration, a deeply ingrained rhythm of life for pastoral peoples like the Fulani and the Maasai. Their entire societies were built around the movement of their herds, following the rains to find fresh grazing land in a delicate and often unforgiving environment. The historian James Ella Webb Jr. describes how these paths were a masterful adaptation to the Sahel's erratic rainfall, a human and animal response to the pulse of the continent itself. Along these routes, more than just cattle moved, caravans of herders traded their livestock for grains and crafted goods with settled farming communities, creating a symbiotic relationship that fed entire regions. This constant interaction became a powerful engine for cultural exchange, spreading languages, artistic styles, and even spiritual beliefs across thousands of miles. The deep roots of this way of life are etched into the very landscape. At sites like Dihar Tichitt, archaeologists have found evidence of ancient cattle enclosures and settlements, proving that this pastoral tradition is thousands of years old. Faded rock art in the Sahara, far from today's grazing lands, depicts scenes of ancient herding, a ghostly reminder of a greener past. Yet the specific annual paths, the precise corridors of migration, were never drawn on any map. They existed as a living geography, passed down through oral tradition from one generation to the next, a mental atlas of waterholes, seasonal pastures, and ancestral resting places. So why are these ancient rhythms now falling silent? The decline is a slow, painful unraveling. The relentless advance of desertification has shrunk the grazing lands, turning once reliable corridors into barren tracts. Modern political borders, drawn with no regard for these age-old patterns, have cut directly across migration routes, turning herders into trespassers. Intensifying conflict over dwindling resources has made once peaceful journeys perilous, and now accelerating climate change and the spread of urban areas are delivering the final blows, steadily paving over and closing off the traditional grazing grounds. The loss is profound. What vanishes is not just an economic system, but an entire identity. The cattle were not merely property, they were living wealth, central to social status, marriage agreements, and religious ceremonies. The decline of the routes fractures communities and severs a living link to a past that shaped the continent. What songs, what stories, what unique knowledge of the land is being lost with the last of the great herds? The silent paths of the Sahel represent a fading chapter of human resilience, a corridor of life that is disappearing before our eyes. This story of a living network severed by modern borders finds a strange and beautiful parallel far away, where a different kind of route connected the classical world to the distant, alluring mysteries of the East. A Greek king in Central Asia minted coins stamped with his own portrait, yet the inscriptions around his face were not in Greek but in a local language. This was the world of the Greco-Bactrian Kingdom, a remarkable crossroads where Mediterranean and Asian cultures collided and blended. From cities like Ai Khanum, with its grand colonnaded courtyards and Greek-style theaters, corridors of trade reached eastward into the mysterious Tarim Basin. These were not just routes for silk and powerful horses, they were conduits for a profound fusion of ideas. Along these paths, the artistic traditions of Greece met the spiritual philosophies of Buddhism, giving birth to a stunning new art form. In sculptures from the region, the Buddha is depicted in graceful, flowing robes, his features bearing a distinct classical serenity, a style that would eventually travel all the way to China and Japan. The very backbone of this trade was the Bactrian camel, the two-humped ship of the desert whose endurance made crossing the brutal Taklamakan Desert possible. These animals carried more than goods, they carried the genetic and cultural signatures of their handlers. The famous mummies of the Tarim Basin, with their European features and brightly patterned woolen textiles, stand as silent, haunting proof of the diverse peoples who traveled these corridors. A handful of Greek coins discovered in Xinjiang are like scattered breadcrumbs, hinting at a connection that was once vibrant and direct. So why did this intricate network, which so effectively linked East and West, simply fade from memory? The kingdom's downfall was swift. In the 2nd century before the Common Era, waves of nomadic invasions from the north shattered the political unity of the region. The stable, urban centers that had supported and protected the trade routes fell into disarray. As scholar Frank L. Holt explains, this political fragmentation made the long, northern journeys far too risky. Merchants seeking safety and predictability gradually shifted their business to the more southerly branches of the Silk Road. The northern corridors, abandoned and left to the mercy of the elements, were slowly buried by the advancing sands of the Taklamakan, their precise paths becoming a matter of archaeological speculation. What was lost when these paths fell silent? We can only wonder at the unique cultural syntheses that might have flourished, the philosophical dialogues that could have occurred between Greek thinkers and Buddhist monks in the caravanserais of Central Asia. The disappearance of the Greco-Bactrian routes is a powerful lesson in how political stability is the invisible foundation upon which all our global connections are built. This Central Asian enigma of a fused world that vanished finds a surprising parallel far across the globe in the vibrant island networks of the ancient Caribbean. A massive canoe carved from a single towering tree rides the swells between islands, its hull filled with glittering guanan and finely painted pottery. This was the Caribbean world of the Taino, a maritime network of canoe routes that connected a constellation of islands into a functioning society. From around 500 CE, these indigenous peoples mastered the wind and currents of the Antilles, their large, ocean-going vessels regularly traveling between islands like Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. These were not random voyages, but established corridors of exchange that sustained a network of chiefdoms known as cacicazgos. The caciques, or chiefs, were the linchpins of this system, controlling the flow of prestige goods and using trade to build alliances and consolidate their power. The artifacts they traded tell a story of a complex culture, with distinctive pottery styles and ceremonial objects spreading across hundreds of miles of open water. Archaeologists like Irving Rouse have traced this web through the discovery of identical three-pointed stones, known as zemes, found on islands separated by treacherous channels. These spiritual objects suggest the routes carried more than commerce. They were conduits for shared religious beliefs and agricultural knowledge, spreading practices like the cultivation of cassava across the archipelago. The very construction of the canoes was a marvel of engineering, requiring the careful selection and hollowing of massive logs, creating vessels stable enough for long, open water journeys guided by an intimate understanding of seasonal weather. Yet the specific sailing paths they took, the exact corridors etched into the sea by generations of paddlers, are now lost. Why did such a deeply rooted network vanish with such stunning speed? The answer arrived with European sails on the horizon. The Spanish conquest of the 15th century delivered a catastrophic three-pronged assault. Old World diseases for which the Taino had no immunity ravaged the population, decimating the communities that built and manned the canoes. Then came the brutal system of forced labor and slavery, tearing people from their ancestral lands and seafaring traditions. Finally, the Spanish imposed their own colonial trade routes, redirecting all economic activity toward their new ports and overwriting the indigenous networks that had thrived for a millennium. The knowledge of the sea, the mental maps of currents and safe passages, died with the last canoe makers and navigators. What stories of resistance and adaptation were lost when those canoes stopped moving between the islands? What tales of migration or heroic voyages were once told on those moonlit shores? The silence that followed the breaking of these sea roads is a profound American tragedy, the erasure of an entire way of life defined by its connection to the ocean. This theme of a vibrant network severed by conquest finds a parallel not in the open sea, but in the dense, watery labyrinths of prehistoric Europe. A trader pulled his dugout canoe through a silent, misty marsh, his cargo not of furs or food, but of golden amber, glowing like captured sunlight in the damp air. This was the forgotten wetland branch of the Amber Road, a fluid highway of rivers and bogs that stretched from the Baltic coast deep into the heart of Europe. While overland trails faced forests and hills, these water corridors offered a smoother, if more secretive, path. Traders navigated a labyrinth of waterways through vast regions like the Pripyat marshes, using the current to carry their precious cargo south toward the Danube and the waiting markets of the Mediterranean. This amber was more than a pretty stone. It was believed to hold the power of the sun, carved into protective amulets and used in sacred rituals. The trade fostered profound cultural exchanges, with Celtic tribes in Central Europe adopting and adapting Baltic amber into their own intricate jewelry and spiritual practices. Sometimes the marshes themselves became part of the ritual, with valuable trade goods, including raw amber, deliberately offered to the waters as bog sacrifices, a silent testament to the corridor's spiritual significance. The Roman historian Tacitus recorded a fascinating account of these northern people gathering amber along the shores, yet the specific water routes they used to move it remain largely hypothetical. How did these fluid paths shape the societies that lived along them? They created nodes of interaction, places where different groups would meet at river junctions or portage points, sharing not only goods but technologies, stories, and genes. These seasonal paths left almost no permanent mark. There were no stone-way stations, only temporary camps on muddy banks. As the Roman Empire expanded, its preference for solid, paved roads made the old, messy wetland routes seem primitive and inefficient. Later, medieval trade became centralized in powerful towns, further sidelining the decentralized marsh networks. The final erasure was slow and environmental. Centuries of land reclamation projects drained the great marshes for farmland, while natural silting clogged the smaller rivers, rendering them unnavigable. The watery trails simply vanished, their routes now buried under fields and cities. The loss of these corridors meant the dissolution of a unique, water-based trading culture, one that moved to the rhythm of the seasons and the flow of the rivers, a subtle but vital thread in the fabric of ancient Europe. Just as these European marsh routes faded into the soil, another vast oceanic network was forging connections across the greatest water body on Earth, linking the islands of the Pacific to the very shores of the Americas. A balsa wood raft rides the Pacific swells, a tiny speck on an ocean of blue. This was the daring hypothesis of Thor Heyerdahl, a proposed corridor running from the coast of South America straight into the heart of Polynesia. His famous Kon-Tiki expedition in 1947 was not a recreation of a known journey, but a dramatic test of a radical idea. Could pre-Columbian Americans, using only the materials and knowledge available to them, have crossed the world's largest ocean and influenced the islands they found? Heyerdahl built his raft using indigenous techniques, lashing together balsa logs with hemp ropes, and then proved such a vessel could indeed survive the long voyage westward, pushed by the prevailing currents and winds. This hypothetical route directly challenged the dominant narrative of human migration, which held that the Pacific was settled from Asia, moving steadily eastward over generations. The Kon-Tiki theory pointed to tantalizing clues like the presence of the sweet potato, a crop native to the Americas, which was found across Polynesia long before European contact. Could this be the botanical proof of an ancient connection? Yet for all its romantic appeal, the corridor remains a ghost in the scientific record. Leading scholars like Patrick Vinton Kirch point to overwhelming evidence from linguistics and genetics that firmly roots Polynesian origins in Asia. The languages of the Pacific share a clear ancestry with those of Southeast Asia, not South America. Genetic studies, while showing a faint, intriguing signal of contact, suggest any such meetings were isolated events, not a sustained two-way exchange. So why would this potential corridor vanish so completely from history? The answer may lie in its inherent fragility. Even if a few brave voyagers did make the incredible journey from east to west, the return trip against the currents would have been nearly impossible. Without a reliable two-way passage, no lasting trade network could be established. The knowledge of such a route would have died with the generation that discovered it, leaving no permanent cultural bridge behind. The disappearance of this corridor is therefore a conceptual one. It is the story of a path that might have been traveled but never truly built. The debate continues, fueled by that stubborn sweet potato and our own fascination with epic journeys. What other ideas or technologies might have been carried on those hypothetical rafts, only to be lost when the voyage proved too difficult to repeat? This speculative journey across the Pacific brings us to a corridor of a very different nature, one that spanned the vast and arid deserts of North America. A desert landscape holds the ghost of a perfect line, an arrow-straight road etched into the earth and visible only from the sky. This was the Chaco Canyon road system, a network of engineered corridors that radiated from the monumental great houses of New Mexico's desert basin. Built by the ancestral Pueblones over 2 centuries, these were not meandering trails. They were formal constructions, often 30 feet wide, cut and leveled into the bedrock, bordered by earthen berms and marked with stone monuments. They connected sprawling complexes like Pueblo Bonito to outlier communities over 50 miles away, creating a cultural web across the harsh San Juan Basin. The roads moved more than goods. They moved people for grand ceremonies and transported massive timbers, carried on foot from distant mountains to build the multi-story structures that still stand today. Archaeologist Stephen H. Lexon suggests these paths were not just practical, they were sacred. Many align precisely with solar and lunar cycles, turning the entire landscape into a vast cosmological map. The Great North Road, for example, runs straight for over 30 miles, pointing not toward a major settlement, but seemingly toward a spiritual direction in the north, a path for the dead or a connection to the ancestors. The sophistication of this network is staggering, with ramps carved into cliff faces and stairways ascending sheer rock walls, all to keep the road perfectly straight regardless of the terrain. This was a society deeply integrated, with turquoise from Chaco mines found as far south as ancient Mexican cities, and macaw feathers and copper bells from Mesoamerica appearing in the canyon's ritual spaces. Yet the entire system collapsed with stunning speed. A prolonged and severe drought in the 12th century gripped the region for decades, straining the delicate balance of life in the high desert. The elaborate social and religious system that required these roads could no longer be sustained. Populations dispersed to areas with more reliable water sources, like the cliffs of Mesa Verde. Without communities to maintain them, the wide, carefully constructed roads quickly succumbed to erosion, their straight lines fading back into the desert floor within generations. What ceremonies, what processions of hundreds of people once moved along these celestial pathways? Why was such a profound spiritual and physical investment so completely abandoned? The silent, empty great houses hold the answer, a testament to a culture that mapped the heavens onto the earth, only to have its connections severed by a changing sky. This American mystery of a culture built on precise alignments finds a final, powerful echo across the Atlantic, where another ancient corridor connected the classical world to the wild, resource-rich shores of the British Isles. The final vanished corridor lies not in desert sands or deep jungle, but beneath the cold, gray waves of the North Sea. A vast, low-lying plain once connected the British Isles to mainland Europe, a landscape of rolling hills, meandering rivers, and dense forests known as Doggerland. For thousands of years, this was not a barrier but a bridge, a thriving territory traversed by Mesolithic hunters following herds of reindeer and wild boar. It was a habitable, resource-rich world, a gateway for the very first human migrations into Britain, with its trails worn deep by the passage of people and animals. Then the world warmed. As the last great ice age retreated, the colossal glaciers melted, and the seas began a relentless, inexorable rise. Around 6,000 years before the Common Era, the rising waters finally breached the low hills separating the Atlantic from the North Sea. The final submergence may have been catastrophically fast, possibly triggered by a monumental underwater landslide off the coast of Norway known as the Storegga Slide, which would have sent a devastating tsunami crashing across this already flooding landscape. The communities living there had no choice but to make a desperate, final retreat to the higher ground that would become the coasts of Britain and the Netherlands, watching their entire world vanish beneath the waves. Scientists like Vincent Gaffney have used advanced seismic mapping to chart this lost world, revealing the ghostly topography of drowned river valleys and hills now hundreds of feet below the surface. The evidence of this lost corridor is occasionally hauled up from the deep by fishermen, their nets bringing up not just fish, but the starkly tangible proof of human life, stone tools, and the massive bones of mammoths that once roamed these dry plains. These finds are haunting, direct links to a world that is completely inaccessible. The genetic links between early British and continental European populations were forged on these sunken trails, and some scholars wonder if the universal flood myths found in cultures across the globe are distant, fractured memories of this and other great inundations. The cultural impact was profound and permanent. The loss of Doggerland did not just change the map, it created an island. Britain was cut off, its connections to the continent severed by the rising tide. This new isolation would shape its development for millennia, fostering a distinct cultural identity that would both resist and absorb influences from across the water, but always from a position of separation. The daily paths of the Doggerland hunters, the specific routes they walked from one valley to the next, are now erased completely, their stories silenced by the sea. And with that final image of a world lost to water, we have reached the end of our journey through these 27 vanished corridors, from the Silk Road to the Saharan salt trails, from the Minoan Sea Lanes to the Mesolithic plains of Doggerland. A powerful pattern emerges. These disappearances were not random. They reveal a fragile triad of forces that build and then obliterate our global connections. Time and again, we see the devastating power of environmental change, the brilliant but often desperate strategies of human adaptation, and the stark, humbling truth that no connection, no matter how grand or vital, is truly permanent. So what do these ghost roads of history ultimately teach us about our own interconnected world? These 27 ghost roads whisper a common story of extinction, one where the end was rarely a single event but a slow unraveling of threads. Three powerful forces repeat like a haunting refrain: climate, politics, and technology. Time and again, a shifting environment delivered the final blow. The Saharan gold routes were choked by advancing dunes, while the plains of Doggerland were swallowed by rising seas. A change in rainfall patterns could turn a thriving river highway like the Gaga Hakra into a dusty grave, or make the long trek across the Tichitt-Walata salt corridor a suicidal gamble. Nature did not just provide the stage for these corridors, it was an active player that could, without warning, erase the board entirely. Political collapse was just as devastating. The Royal Road's eastern spur vanished not because it was poorly built, but because the Persian Empire that funded its messengers was shattered by Alexander the Great. The intricate relay system of the Inca Qiuhapaqnian fell into disrepair after the Spanish conquest deliberately targeted it as a symbol of imperial control. When a central authority falls, the collective will and resources needed to maintain a corridor simply evaporate. The roads are then left to the mercy of the elements, their stonework slowly pried apart by roots and time. Then there is the quiet force of technological and economic change. Why would anyone risk the bandit-infested, sun-scorched amber road when a merchant ship could carry more amber more safely? The northern branch of the Silk Road became a ghost when sea trade proved cheaper and more reliable. The demand for a corridor can vanish long before the path itself does, as we saw when Christianity's simpler rituals caused the market for frankincense to plummet, leaving the desert caravans with no reason to exist. Scholars like Jared Diamond point out that these pressures are often intertwined. A society might overexploit its local environment, like the Garamantes draining their fossil water, making it more vulnerable to a political or economic shock. The collapse of the Chaco Canyon system seems to be a perfect storm of severe drought and a social structure that could no longer sustain its grand ambitions. The disappearance of these routes was never random. They were complex systems that relied on a delicate balance, and when that balance was lost, the corridor faded from memory. This forces us to look at our own world with new eyes. Our global supply chains, our fiber optic cables on the ocean floor, our satellite networks, these are the modern equivalents of the Silk Road and the Minoan Sea Lanes. They feel permanent, but history shows us that no connection is eternal. The same forces that erased the past, a changing climate, political instability, a shift in economic currents, are still very much at work today. What does that mean for the networks we depend on? And if they were to fade, how long would it take for our own stories to be buried by the sand, the sea, or simply the relentless growth of the digital forest? Our journey across these 27 ghost roads reveals a profound truth about our own world. The same forces that built and then erased the Silk Road or the Minoan Sea Lanes are still powerfully at work today. We now weave a global web of container ships, flight paths, and fiber optic cables, networks that feel as permanent as stone, yet history whispers that they are not. A shifting climate can disrupt supply chains as surely as it silted up the Gaga-Hakra River. Political upheaval can sever digital corridors just as it shattered the Persian Royal Road. And a simple change in economic demand could one day render a modern highway as obsolete as the Amber Road. The historian Fern and Braudel once observed that history is the study of time, and time is the great eraser. His words remind us that even our most enduring connections are subject to oblivion, not from a single cataclysm, but from the slow, cumulative pressures of a changing world. This invites a sobering reflection. What corridors are we building today that our descendants might one day struggle to find? Which of our own bustling ports or data hubs will future archaeologists piece together from scattered fragments, wondering at the civilization that vanished so completely? The stories of these lost paths are more than just historical curiosities. They are mirrors held up to our own era of rapid globalization and environmental uncertainty. They teach us that connectivity is a fleeting, fragile achievement, a constant negotiation between human ambition and the immutable forces of nature. If this voyage into the echoes of our past has sparked your curiosity, I invite you to subscribe for more explorations into the world's great enigmas. And please share your thoughts below. Which of these 27 vanished corridors captured your imagination the most? Thank you for joining this expedition through time. May it inspire you to listen a little more closely for the whispers of lost worlds and to see the hidden histories that lie just beneath